Good evening. You are listening to Capital Correspondent on the Voice of Russia. I'm Carmen Russell-Sluchansky here in Washington, D.C. We have a very, very special episode today. Just a few years ago, Jack Abramoff was called the super lobbyist. His lobbying success and his wealth the subject of numerous articles in national newspapers and magazines. In 2005, however, he was convicted of corruption and other charges and spent 4 years in prison. During the federal probe into his lobbying activities, more than 20 other people were similarly convicted, including White House officials, U.S. Representative Bob Ney, and 9 other lobbyists and congressional aides. Since his release, he wrote a book attacking the lobbying industry, arguing that although he should have known he was breaking the law, much of what he did was standard operating procedure, and he has become an outspoken critic of the political system. I'm joined by Mr. Abramoff in studio now. Jack, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. So, Jack, I'm going to start with one of the really hard-hitting questions here. What's it like having yourself played by Kevin Spacey?
Well, he's a great actor, but it's hard to watch somebody play you in a movie, no matter who it is. He's one of my favorite actors, but again, when you see yourself on screen and you know it's not you, it's a little hard to gain some credibility in your own head.
I understand. Well, what did you think of the depiction overall? I mean, you have to argue that it was at least somewhat sympathetic.
I think without question, Spacey really was as sympathetic as anyone could have expected. Certainly I could have expected. He came and visited me in prison along with the director, and we had a pretty good session there, and I think he was basically, he got most of it. The problem was the screenplay was written before he came on that visit and written by somebody who didn't really understand, I think, all the dynamics and the nuances of lobbying and what goes on. But all in all, it was an entertaining piece. It just, again, it's hard to watch yourself on TV or the movie screen.
And of course, there was also the documentary film. It was a little bit more harsh, I think.
Yeah, I was disappointed in the film. I was under the impression it was really going to go after the system and set up a platform for change, but instead it kind of just was about me and old hashed over stories that from the past and things like that. So I thought it was a bit of a wasted opportunity, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, there's also your book, which came out, I think, a couple of years ago, right?
Actually, in November.
Just this last November. Oh, last November. Oh, very recent. Okay. Yeah. Oh, good. Well, then, I read your book.
A couple of years ago, I was in prison. So.
That's right. That's right. Actually, I'm kind of curious. I was wondering about that. Were you writing while you were in prison?
No, I actually, I'd hoped to get a ghostwriter. So being lazy and, kind of procrastinator, I put it off and put it off. I wrote a couple scenes of the book. One of the scenes with Imelda Marcos, one of the golf scenes, actually the scene of the golfing in Russia. That's in the book. I wrote that in prison just as a test to see, what memories and get them down. But my intention was to have a ghostwriter. I went through a couple of ghostwriters. They didn't seem to work out, so I wound up sitting down and writing the whole book myself. Oh,
well, I have to say it's a very fun read. I mean, of course, part of that is simply because it was, extraordinary life up to this point in so many ways. If we can talk about that a little bit, you were effectively, I guess, a good Jewish boy growing up, right?
Well, I tried to be, but yeah.
And then, among other things, you were the president. Was that of the College Republicans?
Yeah, I was national chairman of College Republicans, and headed President Reagan's grassroots lobby on Capitol Hill, and had various other political involvements.
And that put you in pretty good graces, I think, with Ronald Reagan. You were at the White House a number of times, even watched a film with him one time.
Right.
I remember you were a little bit surprised that you hadn't read the invitation very well, apparently.
Right.
And were surprised to say, oh, okay, we're going to watch a movie. I mean, did you feel close to Ronald Reagan?
No, I was a kid, and he was gracious, and he was, to us, the king. I mean, he was the ultimate leader, and he was, of course, president of the United States, leader of the free world, and he inspired me like he did so many others. I had the honor of meeting him and being with him and working with him a little bit, but I can't quite say that I was close to him. I wish I were close to him, but I was just a kid. I was in my early 20s, and it was just a very heady time for me, and it's an experience I'll always cherish.
And your friends back then were Karl Rove, Grover Norquist. I mean, all people who were also very inspired by Reagan, so even more than, say, the leader of the free world, the President of the United States. I mean, he's considered, I mean, he's talked about more in this campaign than anybody else. I mean, even here now in 2012, I mean, he's really kind of considered I guess, the father of the current, Republican movement.
Yeah, I think there's no question about it. He is both inspirational even after his death, but he also had some great success, and some tremendous earth-shattering changes took place both at home and abroad. And I think people more than anything appreciated his grace, his good humor, his humility. And there are qualities that we don't see often in political leaders. His ability to speak extemporaneously and tell jokes and relate to people. You get it in a few leaders, but you don't really get it a lot. And instead, you kind of see awkward people, or people who are arrogant, and people who feel self-entitled. And even if Reagan felt that way, I don't think he let that out. And none of us felt that he felt that way.
But going back to the book and kind of the early years for a moment, so shortly after that, you were leading a national conservative organization, and you pointed out that you were making at I think the age of 26, and this was about 1986, 88, thereabouts. You were making about $150,000, a considerable amount of money. Not even, you weren't even lobbying yet.
Well, actually, that was the lobby. That was the grassroots lobby for Reagan, and it was $150,000. I was 26. It was 1985-ish in his second term, and so yeah, it was really more money than I had made previously, and I was in a tremendous position and started to have the kind of experiences that were kind of foreshadowing perhaps some of the lobbying corruption that would take place later.
But of course, even then, it's a little bit different, I think, than when people think of lobbying and lobbyists. Like you even use the word grassroots, of course. I mean, this is a number of people who form a nonprofit organization to kind of further certain goals. Now, it sounds a little bit like lobbying, but it's a little bit different. You weren't working on behalf of a particular corporation, or would you say that you were? Because I mean, sometimes those.
Yeah, right. No, you put your finger on it exactly. It wasn't special interest lobbying. It wasn't something where we were out there promoting a corporation or a labor union or an individual. We were actually charged with forwarding the agenda of the Reagan administration in the House of Representatives primarily, although part of my staff did the Senate. I was working on the House, and it was in the general interest. They were philosophical, ideological administration things ranging from the Tax Act of 1986 to funding for the Contras and things like that. So it was not lobbying as I later came to know it.
And you did that for a little while, and the next, I think, the next big story is you're making a film with Dolph Lundgren in Africa.
Right.
You want to talk a little bit about that? First of all, you were making this with your brother Robert. You had some connections there. You had connections to Hollywood.
Right. I grew up out there. I went to Beverly Hills High School, and basically that's the public high school in the country that has the most probably movie executives and movie folks come out of it, including actors and the rest. That area didn't interest me, frankly, until I went to law school in Washington at Georgetown and I took entertainment law, and I became more interested in it. When I left politics and during the second term of the Reagan administration, I kind of got a little burnt out. Politics can get to you after a while. And I decided to go into movie making after first looking at real estate and some others. So I wound up writing a film about a Russian soldier, actually, a Soviet soldier, a Spetsnaz officer who went to Africa and with the mission to assassinate the leader of the rebellion, and winds up switching sides. And Dolph Lundgren starred in that, and it was a wild and wacky adventure making the movie. The making of the movie might have been even more exciting than the movie. And so I did that, and then I continued making films and trying to make films for almost 10 years after that period.
So for quite a while. I mean, that's what you were, So, on that, when you eventually got into lobbying, the way it plays out in the book, you almost fell into it. I mean, it really was. It could have just as easily have been Jack+Abramoff, the movie director, Jack+Abramoff, movie producer, I guess, or something. I mean, almost anything else. The restaurateur, which obviously you did that later, but you more or less fell into it. Again, connections came into play. How did you end up working at Preston Gates?
Well, I wanted to get back into politics. I did miss politics during that decade of movie making. I sort of stayed a little bit involved raising money for folks who were running for office, but I wanted to get back into it. I wanted to remain closer to home. We stayed outside of Washington, my family, my wife, and our 5 kids, and I was traveling a lot making movies. So the Saturday after the election, in 1994, when the Republicans, for the first time in my lifetime, had won the Congress, I went to, as I do every day, went to synagogue in the morning, and after services, was approached by the managing director, managing partner of Preston Gates, which was a law firm. They've merged into another law firm at this point, but based in Seattle, and it was Bill Gates' father's law firm, and he approached me and basically asked if I'd like to join the firm and become a lobbyist because of the amount of connections I still had among the Republican conservatives who were now running the Congress.
So who was it exactly that approached you?
His name is Jonathan Blank.
Jonathan Blank.
And he was my across-the-street neighbor and fellow congregant at the synagogue. We were probably the only 2 Republicans there, so we were in the back congratulating each other over the Republican ascendancy. But again, K Street did not have Republicans like me. They didn't have conservatives. They had Republicans like Bob Michael and people like that who were more moderate. But the folks who took over, Newt Gingrich, Dick Armey, Tom DeLay, they were conservatives, and most of K Street had no contact with them at all.
Jack, let's go ahead and get into some of the the thick of what happened while you were working at Preston Gates and the other firm that you were working with. You had a number of clients, I should say. They did range, obviously, from at one point you were working for Microsoft, more or less. If I understand correctly, you didn't particularly like working for them, but you started getting one thing you were known for was working with Native American tribes and helping them work their case in Congress, particularly when they were building casinos. How did you get involved in working with the natives?
Well, my father's attorney from the 70s stayed close to our family, and he was dating the head of government affairs at a tribe in Mississippi, in Philadelphia, Mississippi. And one day he called me and said, they're having a problem, the tribes. The Republicans are going to put a tax on them, on their gaming revenues. Is that something you think you might be able to lobby about? And I thought, gosh, Republicans are adding a tax. That's pretty unusual. So I took the call from the tribe and went to work for them to get rid of this tax, which we succeeded in doing. And that began my relationship with them. For a few years, I only represented that tribe and did things generally for Indian country on their behalf, at their behest, actually. And I eventually started getting some other tribal clients as well.
Now, when I was looking through the Senate report that I'm sure you've looked at and you're familiar with, one of the things that they mentioned there was that along the way, I've actually seen a couple numbers on this that the income that you and your firm charged these tribes was about $66 million. I think the Senate one was that the Senate one, but another amount that I saw was about $82 million. That's you're nodding your head, so that must be more accurate.
I think it's higher. Yeah,
$82 million. Maybe the 66 was particular.
There weren't a lot of accuracies in the Senate report, so who knows? But okay. I think it was north of $80 million.
North of it. What about your own records? Did you have pretty good records?
Yeah, we charged them north of $80 million. At the end of it, we added up what the benefit that our clients got for that 80-something million, and it came out to around $6.8 billion.
So and you certainly argued that. You've argued that, obviously, because one of the charges against you was that you were essentially bilking,
right.
I guess, the Native American tribes. And this caused a lot of consternation and eventually even a change in the leadership of one of the tribes. And I think what happened is, and even as you point out, that Susan Schmidt had come to you. She's a reporter for the Washington Post. That she had originally, and she admitted this in the documentary, her original tips had come from other lobbyists. And you said that, a lot of them were, you suggested that some of them were jealous about, like, the amount of money that you were making. And where you were billing some of your clients for upwards of about $150,000 a month, whereas what was the average, about $10,000?
Yeah, it ranged. I mean, basically, we wound up getting our clients after the other lobbying firms had usually failed them, and they were heading into hundreds of millions of dollars of destruction. And we charged based on the amount of, I was at a law firm twice, First Preston Gates, then Greenberg Traurig. And at law firms, the fees are usually based on the amount of time that partners and associates work on a case times their hourly rate. And over time, I did this for quite a while. Over time, I saw that big efforts, like we normally engaged in, required about an average of $150,000 worth of time a month. So for certain clients, we said, why don't we set the bill at $150,000 a month? Usually it was worth hundreds of millions, again, to save them. Some of them had casinos that were bringing in $400 million a year. So it was money well worth it to them. And we had the distinction, as I look back, something that I'm not necessarily proud of, but we had the distinction of never losing these battles except one time. And so the clients were, we negotiated a fee at the beginning that was higher than other lobbyists. The clients were often in a state of extremis when they came to us because of other lobbyists failing them, and we wound up succeeding for them, and they usually stayed with us. Most of my clients stayed with me the whole time I was a lobbyist.
Now, one of the, you just said earlier, for example, that you were a little frustrated, disappointed, I guess, that the documentary had kind of was more about you than you'd hoped than about the system. But of course, you were at the time, from a lot of perspective, from a, I think a reasonable perspective, even though, maybe you could break down the billing hours, for example, and say, well, $150,000 was not extraordinary. But for what, any client was paying, and the average is about $10,000, and you were charging about $150,000 a month, I mean, there's a huge difference there. So even though there's a problem with the system, and I think you and I agree on that, definitely, you're, I guess, iconic and even a multiple of the system because of what people saw in terms of the charge.
Yeah, I think, by the way, in terms of my view of the movie, the focus on me that I was disappointed in was not necessarily my lobbying activities. It was the old college Republican days. I thought there was an inordinate amount of time spent on that, and that was probably because the only footage they had of me was from that era. So they spent a tremendous amount of time that I thought could have been refocused on the system and refocused on change that needs to happen in the system. But apart from that, yeah, I guess I wasn't the only lobbyist, by the way, charging these amounts. I just happened to be the only one who had the bad fortune to have them reported in the newspaper. Actually, clients, one of my clients was paying at the same time another lobbying firm that was charging them more than I was charging them. But, again, we didn't view our billing as in comparison with other lobbying firms. We viewed it, as did our clients, by the way, based on the value we created for them or the value we saved for them. And unlike other lobbying firms, by the way, most lobbying firms have contracts that'll last a year or 2 years, and they have to be paid for those 1 or 2 years. My contracts with my clients, unless they wanted otherwise, was such that they could fire me that afternoon. Any moment they felt that we weren't delivering more than the value that they were paying us, they could get rid of us. None of them ever did. Until there were political changes in the client's makeup, and their opponents, of course, got rid of us. I did have a client who wasn't an Indian tribe. It was a nation that was paying me, a foreign nation, was paying me a lot of money, who I really wasn't delivering anything for. And I went in one day to their ambassador with a check, and I said, we're not helping you, so you need to fire us, and I brought all your money back for you, because I didn't feel comfortable taking money from a client and not delivering.
And part of what the issues were that things that you were charged for, and was also in the Senate report, was also your relationship, your business relationship with Mike Scanlon, who wasn't a registered lobbyist. He was more of a a political grassroots operative, and I know Susan Schmidt, you point out in the book, had asked you the wrong question. She asked you if basically you were partnered with him, and you were like, no, that's the wrong question. What she didn't ask me was I benefiting financially from it? Because the Senate reports and the documentary and so on go on to say that you were strong-arming your clients to to funnel more, I guess, funds to Mike Scanlon for them to hire him, and you were getting 50%. Was that accurate?
Yeah, what I pled guilty was that I didn't inform my clients formally. Some of them knew, but I didn't inform them formally that I was getting half of the profit of the efforts that Scanlon and I engaged in. These were efforts that took place outside of Washington in the grassroots in their states. They were market protection efforts where, for example, if a tribal casino relied on the people of a certain city to come use their facility, and another casino, tribal or non-tribal, was being placed between them and their market, we were brought in, we were asked by the client to come in and foil that opportunity so that they would not lose their market. This was separate from the Greenberg-Traurig representations, which were all in Washington. I worked on those efforts as well. I helped design them. I certainly worked to implement them, and I didn't, though, inform the clients that I was benefiting financially from them. Sue Schmidt asked me, did I own half of Mike Scanlon's company? That was the question she asked. I answered no, which was accurate. She didn't ask, as she should have asked, was I benefiting financially? I didn't feel obligated to help her write her hit piece on me, so I didn't correct her question. It didn't really matter, to be honest with you, because it's not like anybody waited a few moments to see if any of this stuff was accurate. There was such a headlong rush to vilify and to make us into devils that the minor things were not important. But having said that, the fact is that we were portrayed as having bilked the clients. I was portrayed as having strong-armed them. Nobody forced anybody to hire us. They came to us with these efforts. They came to us with these threats. They were real threats. They're all in the newspapers, independent of our efforts. And we stopped them. And so we negotiated contracts with their lawyers, by the way, for these side efforts, or I should say Mike did. But what my obligation was is to tell them that I was sharing in that money. I don't know that any of them would have said no. They probably wouldn't have said no. I had that obligation. It wasn't my right to take that information and that choice away from them. I did do it. And as a consequence, I went to prison for a long time and have suffered immensely from it, and rightfully so. It was an act of fraud. I regret it, but I can't undo it.
Well, on that, because that's a great place to ask you this question, I do have a question coming in from our Facebook page, and this is from Jackson Davenport Herlong, I think. Mr. Abramoff, would it be fair to say that crime does actually pay? As in, was it worth it, and would you do it again? I'd do 4 years for a couple of million.
No, well, this this must be somebody who's not done any time in prison. I wouldn't do 4 minutes for more time for a couple million or any amount of money in prison. It's a horrific experience at every level of prison, but crime does not pay. And crime certainly didn't pay for me in the sense that where I did break the law, I was not only basically stripped of everything I owned and all of my wealth and assets, taken away from my family, put into a horrible prison, internationally besmirched reputation. It was certainly not worth it. If I could undo it, I would. You can't undo life, so I can't, but it's definitely not worth it. It's worth following the rules and letting things fall where they may and not trying to control everything by changing the laws or trying to rather do it by disregarding the laws.
Going back to the documentary for a second, because you said that one of the things that disappointed you was that they kind of focused a lot on the Republicans, your Republican cohort, I guess, if I can say that. And one of the things I thought that was interesting, one of the things they were clearly, what I saw them trying to do was probably a little bit beyond having the extra footage. But you have somebody like Grover Norquist and Ralph Reed, if we look at both of them, who come. As a lot of people see him having very strong morals. There may be morals that, a lot of people disagree with, but Ralph Reed is the ultra-conservative, religious conservative, fighter for religious conservative morals, if you will. Grover Norquist is, of course, everything is about lowering the tax rate. Love him or hate him, you have to appreciate that their resilience and steadfastness to these issues. But it seems as if they got caught up in this, and I don't think either one of them was charged. But at the same time, Grover Norquist, found himself working in, I'll talk about the Northern Mariana Islands in a bit, but he found himself working on behalf of companies who want to set up shop in what some people call sweatshops in the Northern Mariana Islands. Ralph Reed had left the Christian Coalition to start his own company. I was watching his press conference about that. Essentially to kind of cash in on what was going on all the money that was running around, that you've talked quite a bit about, running around Washington. So even though I'm certainly not going to argue it was because they were Republicans, but how did they get caught up in this? And I mean, isn't it fair to say it was like, well, these gentlemen, they say things, and should we really adhere to what they say now that we know that when there is a buck to be made, things will change?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question. Grover was thoroughly investigated. I guess so was Ralph. They didn't break any laws. They didn't do anything at the end of the day that was indictable or pleable or anything like that. In terms of what they did versus what people said they did, Grover got involved in political efforts where my clients were involved in political efforts where Grover agreed ideologically with the client's position. Grover was a consultant of Microsoft, by the way, but the other clients I had were contributors to Americans for Tax Reform, promoting the anti-tax agenda. So I don't know that necessarily it's inconsistent for him to have worked on issues where he's in agreement ideologically and where the client is making contributions to his organization where the client, in fact, agrees, as the Indian tribes did very adamantly, with the low tax or no tax approach that Grover has. In terms of Ralph, I mean, I think Ralph got into a different problem. Ralph's situation was very different, actually, than Grover's. Ralph was personally a consultant to the efforts. Ralph was working on the trying to foil the efforts of others to start casinos, primarily in the South. And Ralph was paid for that and benefited financially, personally. So a little bit different than Grover. But, he had become by then a consultant. It was something that he agreed with. Philosophically, I think where Ralph got in trouble, though, is his desire to kind of hide the source of the money. Mm-hmm. And I wrote about this in the book. I disagreed with his approach, and I think if he had taken the approach that I outlined, he probably would have had less problems, which would basically be honest about it. Once everything was coming out in the open, I didn't speak to the media basically until I got out of prison. But when I did, I've taken the tack that there's no point to not being honest about these things. They all spilled out, and whether or not I would have been honest while I was a lobbyist, I don't know. I didn't have the opportunity. I didn't really speak to the media. I want to believe in my heart of hearts maybe I could have been, but to be honest with you, I wouldn't have stopped the lobbying when I was doing it, and I didn't stop the lobbying, so I can't quite look back and say, gee, I would have realized it was all wrong and all bad. I wish I could. But to be honest with you, I wouldn't have, and I didn't. So in terms of Ralph, his approach just politically for himself, and I think morally would have been better had he come forward and said, yes, I took money from the Indian tribes, and here's what I did with it. I stopped the advent of 7 new mega casinos in the South. I'm against gambling, they're against gambling. If it were up to me, frankly, I'd get rid of their casinos. I can't do that. But I can take their money and stop additional casinos, and that's what I did. I went to some of the Christian groups, I went to Christian Coalition and asked for help and money, and they didn't give me any. So I either had to sit by and watch casinos get built or stop them, and I chose to stop them. I think if he had done that, he may not have pleased everybody in the Christian political movement, but I think people would not have looked at him like he's a hypocrite. And unfortunately, that's what happened, and that's why he lost his race for lieutenant governor later that year.
Your work on behalf of the Northern Mariana Islands was a large part of the Senate report. It was a large part of all the reports, I guess, that I read in the newspapers and so on. You were effectively working for the Northern Mariana Islands, the Commonwealth of the Northern, the CNMI, this is what it's often referred to, right? Mm-hmm. And on behalf of the government there, and then governor, is this how it, just actually I want to clarify, is that how it works?
Yeah, we worked for the governors. We worked for first a governor named Froilan Tenorio, and then a governor named Pedro Tenorio.
Okay, so when you were working for them, you were trying to keep, there was a bill that had been passed, you have to correct me, I think, bringing in a minimum wage, bringing their minimum wage up to U.S. standards. Right,
what happened was, just a little bit of background, the Marianas are a U.S. territory, one of 5 U.S. territories, and they joined the United States after World War II. After World War II, all of the Pacific Islands that had been conquered by Japan were put in trust to be controlled or administered by the United States. Eventually, in the 60s and 70s, the United States offered each of these places a choice. They could either become independent or they become part of the United States. The Marianas opted to become part of the United States. They negotiated an agreement to join us whereby they ceded the land and all the seabed, 200-mile seabed around 13 islands, in exchange for a certain economic opportunity. One is that they wanted to control their own minimum wage locally, since they're in an Asian economy, not really in the U.S. economy. And number two, they wanted to control immigration so that they could both have tourism without any great complications and also be able to bring some workers onto the island. There were only 20,000 people who lived there. These two were kind of the hallmarks of the agreement. The agreements stood fine for about 20 years. The Marianas started to develop industries, including an industry of shirts, making shirts and garments. And then all of a sudden, the local Unite Union in the United States, the former Lady Garment Workers Union, decided they didn't like this because they were making shirts and bringing them in with a U.S. label at minimum wage that wasn't quite the U.S. minimum wage. Their minimum wage was a little more than half of what the U.S. was. It wasn't Asian standard. It wasn't $1 a week, but it was about $3 and something an hour plus benefits. So they launched a campaign of vilification on the island, and the island came to Washington to get some lobbyists. And they met with a bunch of different lobbying firms, including us, and they didn't hire us. They hired another firm. And by the time that firm was done representing them, the U.S. Senate passed by unanimous consent legislation, this is in 1995, to strip away those two economic benefits. Immediately they hired us. When I pitched our firm to this island, to the Commonwealth, I was the only one to say to the governor and his staff that we can win this. The rest of them said, let's lose as slow as possible. We'll help you negotiate the end of your industries over time. I said, that's nonsense. This should not be happening in a Republican Congress. So what I did was they came back, and the senior partner of our firm, who's now deceased, a man named Lloyd Meads, who was a former liberal Democratic congressman, and I got on an airplane to go out to the islands to make sure that the accusations, which were absolutely outrageous about what's going on those islands, was not happening. And Lloyd went from factory to factory inspecting them. He was a former Labor Committee member and inspected factories, and he gave it a clean bill of health, and we took them on. The vilification campaign didn't stop, though, and the effort to keep them from having a federal takeover, which lasted the entire time that I was the lobbyist, basically, while the governors were in power, continued, and we were successfully able to thwart the efforts to stop them.
Can we talk about your trip there, and then we'll get to some of the other trips, because
Sure.
you had visited quite often. Around this time, you had George Miller, for example, saying that there were incidents where you had factory workers who were not getting paid, who were brought in, Chinese factory workers who were being brought in by people such as Willie Tan. Was that his name? Willie Tan?
He was one of the folks who owned one of the factories. Yes.
Owned one of the factories. And he was saying that according to some investigations, and there was also an article in Ms. Magazine around that time, which was saying that there, a number of Chinese women who, really couldn't even live off of what they were making in the factories.
Well, that was actually completely incorrect, and the Senate subsequently had hearings to expose this, these fallacious accusations. It was actually the opposite. The Chinese women workers who came in would return after their 2-year contract in Saipan, if they weren't extended, back to China, and they were considered, in many of the villages they returned to, by far the most wealthy people there. They often built big homes. They often created businesses and wound up employing people. That's why these jobs are so highly valued, because in Saipan, their food and lodging was all covered, and the money that they earned was basically net money. And although it's not, by our standards, the kind of money that we would be able to live off well, when you take back home to China 2 years working at $3 or whatever it is an hour, and it all adds up, these people actually wound up creating some successful businesses, and some of them came back actually to report this in the Congress.
Where were the protests from? I mean, I did
the protests were they were generated in essence from the union, from some of the people on the island who didn't like the fact that Willie, who was an American of Guamanian descent and Chinese descent, they weren't sort of culturally the same folks as others on the island. There were a lot of internal fights going on there. There were some people, by the way, who were mistreated on that island. There's some people who are mistreated 2 blocks from the studio, I'm sure, in terms of their workplaces.
I'll have to investigate that.
But I think what was important and what convinced us to take this client was that the attitude of the government on the ground was that they were going to prosecute, and did, by the way. They raided factories where there were accusations. They raided factories where there was more than allegations, where they could prove it, and they arrested people and they prosecuted them. And because the government's attitude was one of heavy prosecution, plus the fact, by the way, that there were so many OSHA and other inspectors and investigators on the island at all times, it would have been almost impossible, by the way, to get away with having a sweatshop on that island. There were too many press, too many people there looking for this, including us, by the way, and including the visitors. We brought 150 members of Congress and their staff, and often they were given cars and just told, go ahead. The island was small enough, they would drive and do their own inspections.
So, all right, so on that, since you brought us to it, let's go ahead and talk about that. You know, one of the, it seems like, you know, you've got to be looking back and looking at that and thinking, what a PR nightmare that you were setting up at the time. I mean, never mind the potential legal pitfall here, but basically having, you know, the Northern Mariana Islands, you know, through you essentially be recruiting congressmen to go to a, you know, a nice tropical island, you know, granted, I do buy that they spent some time you know, looking at factories. But there was also some golf to be played.
No question about it.
No.
As there, by the way, I've been congressman in Russia. I've been congressman in Europe. I've been congressman everywhere. I've been congressman in Islamabad, and they play golf. Okay. All right. So I mean, this is just into the DNA of the Congress. Or go to the beach. George Miller, by the way, would go there and go on the beach. And sit on the beach.
But then he would go back and then, you know, basically vote against you. I guess.
Yeah, well, we didn't bring him there. I mean, we didn't bring George Miller there. But he had an agenda. He had a different agenda. That's all.
But do you look back and you know, when you think about that, would you look back now and think it's like, you know, my God, wow, what a, you know, of course, because you know, they never mind your emails for a second. I know your emails were completely, you know, explored by the FBI and by, you know, everybody who was investigating you and so on. But when you think, it's like, you know, a lobbyist is essentially taking a congressperson to the Mariana Islands, to this tropical resort, you know, paradise, effectively, you know, not on, you know, let's say on your client's dollar, because because the CNMI was actually paying, because it wasn't you, because that's the difference, right? Because that would have been clearly illegal if you were paying directly,
right. Well, I wouldn't have done it. To fund 150 trips to the Marianas, I wasn't that rich. But absolutely, it was legal. It still is legal. You know, as I look now, and I'm working very hard to try to reform the system, you know, and I look at that particular set of facts where we had all these trips and they were going out there. And yeah, they were certainly in the off time. You know, we'd start the meetings at 6 in the morning with them. There would be every day, there'd be a period where they had a break and they played golf or they went to the beach or they went shopping, whatever they did on their own. I look back on that and I say, you know, gee, it's unfortunate that they had to do that. Now, why do they have to do that? Because the Washington Post and others were painting a picture of this island as if it was literally hell on earth. That this was a place where women are getting raped and forced abortions and prostitution and slave shops and sweatshops and this and the other thing. And we knew by going there, Lloyd Meets and I, that that was a lie. But we realized also it was halfway around the world, and no matter how much we bleated that it was a lie, the fact is most congressmen wouldn't believe us. So we had to, we felt, bring them there, let them see for themselves, and what we did was, Republicans and Democrats, we created 150 allies who saw the truth. So then when they were confronted with the lies here, they were able to respond to it. Now the problem is, though, that that is a lot of money, and that's the very lobbying problem that I see today. I think ultimately, and I do deal with this in the book, I deal with it in the sense of an example that I give. What do you do if you own a company and all of a sudden they're going to make your company basically illegal? Do you just sort of take it? Do you fold up? Do you just perform illegal acts, or do you go lobby Washington? The truth is you go lobby Washington. The problem doesn't always exist with the client. with the people who want to lobby or want to fix their situation, or even with the lobbyists always, the problem almost always exists with the Congress. When the Congress overreaches the bounds of where the government should be, where the Congress can step in basically and abrogate a covenant, an agreement with the people who ceded thousands and thousands of miles of land to the United States for basically two things, and then take it away from them, that's the problem. But that's never really the focus. People never look at the Congress and say, you know, you guys are the villains. You guys are doing the wrong stuff. Instead, they look at the lobbyists, and, you know, lobbyists like I was, and that's not to say I wasn't a villainous lobbyist. I was. I took every advantage I could. I spent every resource I could. I basically operated completely contemptuously within the law 99% of the time, and 1% of the time went over the line. And the fact is, though, as I just mentioned, one can be completely corrupt within the law. These laws need to be changed. And overall, the structure of Washington needs to be changed. We really need to revert back to what the founders had in mind, that not every problem is solved here, so that therefore we don't need 30,000 lobbyists here, because not every problem is going to be solved here.
So what you're saying is that never mind what is actually illegal. The system itself, there's so much, gray area would suggest that, hey, maybe it's legal, maybe it's not. But I know that's one of the problems that you're also pointing out. But even what is strictly legal is really problematic, because it feeds the system. I mean, like all Congress congressional candidates obviously take money. They have to take campaign contributions. That's the only way to work it. So what is the solution to that?
Well, I'm working right now with United Republic, and we're trying to come up with some solutions. One of the solutions is to restrict the amount of money to a very small amount that lobbyists are allowed to give. We can't really bar them completely under the court system today from giving money, but make it a de minimis amount that they're permitted to give. Expand the definition, by the way, of what a lobbyist is. How could it be that somebody like Tom Daschle or Newt Gingrich are saying that they're not lobbyists? Of course they're lobbyists, but they don't fit within that exact definition of lobbyists. I wrote a column, write columns for WND.com, WorldNet Daily, and I wrote a column asking, was I ever a lobbyist? And because when I was a lobbyist, I just registered. I figured I'm a lobbyist. You have to register. I registered. I never read the definition of lobbyist in the 1995 Lobbying Disclosure Act, because I never frankly thought I had to. I went back after the Newt Gingrich campaign and read it. And you know what? I'm not certain I was a lobbyist. So that has to be changed. It has to be tightened up, and it has to be that anybody who comes here and lobbies or is involved in the lobbying campaign is a lobbyist and needs to register. Now, that group of people and their clients need to be prohibited from giving anything other than a de minimis, minuscule amount of money so that it's constitutionally acceptable. That special interest money in the system is what is tilting the playing field. That's the money that enables a lobbyist like me, like I was, to have incredible power in this town. And that's just not fair. And most Americans out there resent it, and I think most Americans will want to fight it. The second thing is the revolving door. The fact that we were talking earlier about people cashing in. Now, those two gentlemen weren't government servants. You have people who work for the government who basically go through the revolving door and cash in.
Like Scanlon.
No, well, yeah, like Scanlon, absolutely. Scanlon worked for DeLay, like virtually 90% of them up there. When I was up there meeting with congressmen and their staff, I got the impression, and sometimes I got the direct impression through their conversation, that 90% of them wanted to come work for me and make more money. They don't all show up like that, but they quickly turn into that. So
that's potentially a triple increase or triple salary
absolutely,
increase.
If not more. And so that revolving door needs to be shut. It at least needs to be stretched out. I don't know that we can make it a lifetime bar like I advocate in the book. I've since had an opportunity to be working with constitutional scholars, but it could be 10 years. It could certainly be a long period of time, so as that people cannot cash in on their public service. The next thing is term limits. This is something that, frankly, I opposed as a lobbyist, because once you buy a congressional office, you don't have to rebuy it in 6 years. You want to be able to keep it. You want every congressman to be there as long as Strom Thurmond, our senator, who was 100 years old before he left. You want the Undertaker taking them out because you basically have invested money in them. So term limits, get fresh blood in here. There are plenty of people in America who would do a superb job as legislators, not just 535.
We just have a minute left, so I'm just going to ask you for a short response to this. But we did get another Facebook question here. And he wondered, this is Sean Gurnant, who was wondering if, do you think you would have continued on if you hadn't been caught? Or maybe if, you're on a crusade now to kind of fix the system, and we're only going to have like 30 seconds, I'm sorry. But if you hadn't gotten caught, or let's say if Bush had pardoned you, would you be? Do you think that you would have seen the light in another way?
Well, the Bush pardon me thing would not have changed anything because I came to see the light before I got to prison. Unfortunately, I'd love to say that, yes, I would have stopped. No, I wouldn't have stopped. I didn't think I was doing anything wrong. I was deeply in the forest, and people there don't think they're doing things that are immoral. They think that's the way the system is. That's the problem. And so, unfortunately, I don't think I would have stopped. I wish I could say yes.